came up to a case a couple of years back, I think it was 2005, called Ashcroft v. Raich. And it was located out in California. California, if you're not aware, permits the prescription of marijuana to treat certain medical maladies. Angel Raich was sick. She got a prescription from her doctor. She was using medicine, marijuana as medicine to treat her illness, and the marijuana she was using was grown on her own property. It never entered into any stream of commerce. It was never bought or sold. And in fact, there is no legal market for drugs. The law won't permit there to be. And yet, Congress said, this runs afoul of federal drug laws. She must suffer the consequences. And she raised the question again. She said, look, not only has this never been in the stream of commerce, there is no stream of commerce in this product to affect. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court said it doesn't matter. We think that this fits within the powers under interstate commerce. So, in a very real sense, we're kind of back to where we were at Wicker v. Feldman. There is still the possibility that Lopez and Morrison, those other two cases, might indicate limits to what Congress can do under the Commerce Clause, but it's a big question. We don't know. Looking at the individual health insurance mandate and how this all plays into it, like I said, it presents a very unique question because we're no longer dealing with the question of commerce that is taking place. We are specifically dealing with the question of commerce that is not taking place. If someone is going to be punished under this law, it's going to be because they chose not to purchase something that they didn't want. And the question the courts are going to have to ask is, does the power to regulate interstate commerce mean that Congress can tell individual Americans, you must buy this, whether you want it or not? That's a big question. And we can't know for sure how it's going to come out. But I'll give you a guess a little bit later on. The next question that we're going to have to deal with is the 10th Amendment. I almost hesitate to talk about this because I think that people have a little bit of a skewed understanding of the 10th Amendment. What the amendment actually says is that any power not delegated to Congress is reserved to the states or the people. Sometimes people automatically assume that means we're talking about areas of legislation. And courts have sometimes treated it that way, but I think more likely, and this is my stab at it, I think more likely if Congress, or if the Supreme Court says that Congress has the authority under the Commerce Clause to do something, the 10th Amendment becomes inapplicable. That is my guess. It's not necessarily how it will go down, but it's my guess. Now, there are still certain limits that Congress faces in how they can kind of deputize state functionaries, like state agencies or state police. There are limits to what they can do in requiring these state agencies to enforce a federal law, but as far as invalidating the entire legal scheme, I think that there are some serious questions about whether the 10th Amendment will be a barrier over and above the Commerce Clause, restriction on Congress's power. So that's my thought on that. But there are other constitutional provisions that I think we can and should be talking about. We have a Bill of Rights in this country. And under the Bill of Rights, the Supreme Court has recognized a handful of very important freedoms that are understood to be inherent in people. At one point in time, they recognized a right to contract. Over time, they've kind of backed off on what that means, although, to the best of my knowledge, courts still understand that there is a right to contract. It's just a question of how they will apply that right. There is a freedom of association. which says that, number one, we are permitted to associate with and gather with the people with whom we choose to meet. There's also a flip side to that says that we cannot be forced into association with people that we choose not to associate ourselves with. Now, there are limits. One of the things that courts have steadfastly said is that freedoms are not absolute. Even constitutional freedoms are not absolute. And they will typically engage in a kind of balancing test where they look at the interests that the government is trying to serve by passing a particular law, and they'll weigh that against the liberty interests that the person who's facing punishment asserts for themselves. When it comes to freedom of association, there have been some significant restrictions on that because of the way that some people chose to pursue that freedom. For example, we had certain clubs, like golf courses, that would say, we only want to be open to white men. We don't want black people here. We don't want women here. And the courts looked at this and they said, generally speaking, look, you are generally open to the public, and because of this, you cannot deny people access based on something they can't control. You can't deny someone access just because they're black. You can't deny them access just because they're female. So there are definitely limits to the freedom of association. However, it does remain a vital right to which Americans are entitled. And my suspicion is that if courts were faced with the question, can Congress force you to associate with an insurance provider that you don't want to, I think that's something they'll have to take seriously. And then I think probably the most likely individual liberty where we might be able to make hay, and I know that some people will kind of chafe at this, but the right to privacy. A lot of particularly conservative legal scholars question whether there really is any right to privacy, and therefore they may not be comfortable going this route. However, courts have steadfastly secured a right to privacy, and it's one of the rights that they're most interested in protecting. And if you think about what happens when you are forced to buy a health insurance policy, you have to divulge to strangers all sorts of information about yourself, very private information. And what I think the people responsible for defending this law are going to have to do is explain to the courts why Congress's interest in lowering health insurance rates, which is really what the goal is. The goal is it's not to provide health care to everybody. That's not what the bill would do. The bill simply requires everyone to pursue their own health insurance policy. And it wants to lower health insurance rates to make that easier to do, theoretically. So Congress will say, our goal here is to try and lower insurance rates. And the courts will say, is that goal sufficient to require people to sacrifice their right to privacy, their right to associate with people of their own choosing, their freedom to contract or not contract? I think there's a pretty good bet that the Supreme Court will not, especially in its current composition, that the Supreme Court will not allow that health insurance mandate to do these things. So, like I said, I'll give you my ultimate guess on how that all will play out at the end of this session.